to you so we can get straight into the presentations. The first speaker is Dr. Kelsey Norman, who's a fellow for the Middle East at Rice University's Baker Institute and director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights and Refugees program there, and published this month her new book, which is called Reluctant Reception, Migration and Governance in the Middle East and North Africa, which is out with Cambridge University Press. And the second speaker is Dr. Gerasimos Tsourapas, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And he has worked extensively on the politics of migration, refugees and diasporas in the Middle East, including last year a book, The Politics of Migration in Modern Egypt, Strategies for Regimes Surviving Autocracies, which won a prize from International Studies Association and is available, as is Kelsey's book, in all good bookshops. So we're delighted they've been able to join us here this afternoon, because this for a long time has been an important aspect to work within the Migration Policy Centre, thinking about not only Europe's relations with non-EU member states, but also the distinctive politics and social dynamics associated with migration outside of Europe. It's a big focus for our work and our ongoing projects. So we're delighted that Gerasimos and Kelsey have been able to join us. So what we will do today, as normal, is have presentations, then we'll have plenty of time for comments and discussion. But if you want to be involved in the discussion, and we're very happy if you want to put questions, then please do so using the chat function on our YouTube channel. So you will see alongside the images a chat function, and in that, if you put comments, questions, points for discussion, we'll be very happy to raise those with the speakers after the presentations. So I'd like, I think Kelsey's going to go first, so I'd like to invite Kelsey to take the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. Let me just pull up my presentation. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see this. So thank you again so much for joining me today. This is actually my first talk on this recently published book. It just came out 2 weeks ago, so I'm pretty excited. Thank you for allowing me to sort of have you as my test audience. So the book is called Reluctant Reception, Refugees, Migration and Governance in the Middle East and North Africa. So a major premise of the book is that whilst we are sort of bombarded by images such as this of migratory journeys heading towards Europe or towards maybe North America or Australia, the reality is that much of the world's migration takes place between countries of the global south. And this will come as sort of no surprise to many of you, considering the audience for the Migration Policy Center, but nonetheless, it is still a major discrepancy, whether we're talking about photographs we see in newspapers, with policy reports, or within the academic literature. There's much more of a focus on the journeys and arrival of migrants and refugees in countries of the global north. But as we know from the 2015 quote-unquote crisis in Europe and the arrival of predominantly Syrian refugees, we can see just from this infographic that at the time that many of these arrivals were occurring between 2015 and 2016 in Europe, they really paled in comparison to the number of Syrian refugees that were being hosted in countries of the Middle East and North Africa. So you can see these green dots representing asylum applications filed in Europe versus the numbers that were being hosted in countries neighboring Syria. And this is a broader phenomenon beyond just 2015 or beyond Syrian refugees in particular. Nearly half of the world's migration takes place between countries of the global south, and just more than half is individuals traveling to countries of the global north. And this is much more pronounced for global refugees. 86.3% of refugees are housed or inhabiting countries of the global south. But again, you wouldn't know this necessarily from newspaper articles, from policy reports, and even within the academic literature. So I see this book as sort of part of a corrective to that. I think that me, along with many other scholars at the moment, are reinvestigating, why do we know less about how countries of the global south respond to migrants and refugees? So the main central research question then of this book is, how do Middle East and North African host states strategically manage their migrant and refugee populations? And I break down that larger question into sort of 3 sub-questions. So how do states respond to new patterns of settlement? So what is the sort of initial response? What causes a response from a host state to change over time? And what are the consequences of a chosen policy for individual migrants and refugees living in that host state? And for the purposes of today's talk, I'll predominantly be focusing on this first question: how do states respond to patterns of settlement? But the book really does sort of treat each of these questions in turn and sort of gives them equal weight. So just to give you a roadmap of what we're going to cover today, I'll present part of my central argument in the book. I'll talk about the methods that I use in the book and the cases. I'll present some initial, very, very broad case study evidence, but you kind of have to read the book to get a better sense of the sort of deep dive I'm doing into each of these cases. And then I'll talk about the larger picture and some of the policy implications of this research. So why do we know less about why countries of the Global South, how countries of the Global South respond to migrants and refugees? In the book, I talk about some assumptions that are embedded within this existing literature on migration and refugees that maybe accounts for why we haven't studied these states to the same extent as countries of the Global North. So one is this assumption about the impermanence of migrants and refugees. So refugees who are fleeing war or unrest or another sort of dire situation in their home state are assumed to, initially seek refuge and then probably return once that situation has rectified itself. But as we know, in reality, many refugee situations are becoming protracted or have been protracted, and it's not always the case that a refugee is able to or willing to return to their home country. In terms of migrants, it's often assumed that countries in the Global South are really just transit countries that people are passing through en route to other countries of the Global North. But in reality, as a result of changing security regimes, and I talk in the book a lot about the policies of Europe and how that has affected why we're seeing the patterns that I'm studying, it's not always the case that migrants can complete their intended journey. So they end up sort of more or less stuck in countries of the Global South that are considered transit states, but are also host states. Another assumption embedded in this literature, and this is changing, but there has been previously more of a focus on camps as spaces of settlement for refugees, rather than urban spaces, even though now it's more than half of the world's refugees that live in urban spaces. And in a camp situation, it might be the case that a refugee is not going to have a great deal of interaction with host country nationals or host country authorities, but that's not true of urban refugees and certainly not true of urban migrants living in these large cities. So in these types of spaces in an urban environment, the question of how a country responds and how host country authorities respond is very relevant. Third, and this is one I really focus on in the book, there's this implicit assumption that Global South host states just don't necessarily have the capacity to engage, and that we shouldn't really expect much of their response to migrants and refugees because they don't have the ability or are sort of considered weak states. That's especially true of countries that are non-democratic or semi-authoritarian. I take issue with this in the book and sort of challenge this assumption by trying to understand what are reframing these states as even if they don't necessarily have the same capacity as other countries of the Global North, they're nonetheless strategic actors in terms of when they decide to utilize state capacity to respond to migrants and refugees. So that leads me into sort of one element of my main argument, which is that perhaps we're just missing what states have been doing in terms of responding to migrants and refugees. So I come up with this term I call, or this policy I call, indifference or strategic indifference. And this is when a state response is characterized by indirect engagement. So it's engagement from the state, but it's mediated by international non-governmental organizations, international organizations, broadly speaking, as well as NGOs, local NGOs, who kind of do most of the service provision and other sort of direct engagement on the state's behalf. Now, what I argue is that if we consider this as an option, if we consider this as a real state response, then it allows us to understand how diplomatic and economic concerns might be driving host state responses as much as, or at least as much as, the capacity of each host state. And in terms of how this affects migrants and refugees, I look at sort of benefits and drawbacks. So it does allow for the de facto economic and social integration of migrants and refugees in terms of those living in these large urban environments, but it does have drawbacks in terms of lack of protection and sort of the possibility that situations might change quite quickly. So if we think about these different types of, if we try to sort of place engagement with other types of with other responses from the state, I argue that there are sort of three we can think about rather than two, as has been previously defined in the literature. So by engagement, I mean any interaction, whether it's direct or indirect, that a state has with migrants or refugees residing on its territory. And in a liberal model, which is what we're probably most familiar with in terms of when we think about something like integration, this is characterized by the goal of bringing migrants or refugees into a national system. A repressive policy, on the other hand, aims to remove migrants from the state, whether through force, things like policing and detention and even deportation. But indifference, this third option, again, is characterized by this indirect engagement that's mediated by international NGOs and NGOs, and it's characterized by de facto integration. So it's not entirely bringing refugees or migrants into the state, but it's not entirely removing them either. And if we try to map this on these two axes of how much in terms of resources is required by the state in order to implement the policy versus the goal of the policy, whether it's more to exclude, more to include, we can see that a repressive and liberal policy both require relatively high resource expenditure on the part of the state. But indifference is a pretty cost-effective policy, so it doesn't require too much in terms of state resources. And again, its goal is to neither entirely exclude, but neither entirely include migrants or refugees within the host state. So in order to understand how this theory maps onto empirical reality, in the book, I look at three cases, Morocco, Egypt, and Turkey, which you can see from this map are more or less along three main migratory pathways leading up towards Europe. But as I said earlier, the reality is that not everyone is able to complete their migratory journey, and many people end up sort of lingering in these countries for extended periods of time. And I can talk more in the Q&A about the case selection, but that's just to give you a basic idea. So this project involved, when I counted it all up, about 25 months of field work. Ended up conducting just over 130 interviews. And I talked with elites, so those are individuals in government agencies in each of the countries. I talked with international organizations like the UNHCR and IOM, other IOs that are involved in migration and refugee protection, and local NGOs. And I also spoke with individual migrants and refugees of varying nationalities. And the data collected from the migrant and refugee interviews is used throughout the book, but also specifically in one chapter where I try to assess our different nationalities of migrants and refugees sort of given different treatment in each host state. So to paint this in sort of very broad strokes, what I'm depicting is this policy trajectory. So I argue that in the 1990s and 2000s, each of these countries utilized indifference. And it looked a little bit different in each country, but it's more or less this idea that international INGOs and local NGOs stepped in to provide basic services on the state's behalf, that there was this de facto integration that was permitted by the state. And then in the second decade of the 2000s, we have this shift in each of the countries towards different types of policies. So in Egypt, we see, at least for a period of time, a shift to a more repressive policy. And then in Morocco and Turkey, there were these grand, large policy reforms that occurred, even though in some sense, the day-to-day situation did not change so much for migrants and refugees. So I talk in the book about why these shifts occurred. So in Egypt, it was a period of intense securitization of the field of migration more broadly, sort of grouping migration together with things like border security, terrorism, other sort of what were considered threats to the state. And this was just following the military coup in Egypt in 2013. And then in Morocco and Turkey, we saw these, like I said, these major policy reforms that were driven primarily by a coupling of international shaming and sort of diplomatic and economic interests. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A as well, but I do talk a lot about that in the book. What did those two things look like in each of the two countries, Morocco and Turkey? And I think this will fit well also with what Gerasimos is going to present on in the next talk. And I talk about different alternative explanations for this. And so one, again, that I'm pushing back against a lot in this book is that, this assumption that, well, maybe these states just don't have the ability to do much. And that's why we don't really see, formal policy in this time period that I'm calling indifference. And I talk, in each of the three cases about how I think that is not the case based on this data and examination. In Morocco and Turkey, we can see that the states enacted these large policy reforms, not because they suddenly had more capacity, but because their interests changed, because they saw different incentives than they had seen previously as regards migration. In Egypt, I think a really interesting little anecdote that I'm going to share here also illustrates the state presence rather than lack of capacity on this issue. So if you're familiar with Egypt, this is a photo from the 2013 massacre, the Rabaa massacre, which occurred a few months after former President Mohamed Morsi was deposed from power. So his supporters had staged this large sit-in in Cairo, calling for the military government that came to power to restore his presidency. They were hundreds were brutally attacked and killed by Egyptian security forces in the middle of August. And this is, a very dark moment for Egypt. So I'm having a conversation with one of the school directors of a refugee school in Cairo. There's many. This is one director who was telling me a story about how on the morning of the Rabaa massacre, he received a phone call from the Ministry of the Interior, a representative from the Ministry of the Interior who spoke perfect English. She called him and let him know that he should not open his refugee school that day because there was going to be impending unrest. And this was unusual because he had never spoken with the Ministry of the Interior before. His school was not registered with the government, which it should have been, but it was not. So he had never had any direct interaction with Egyptian authorities. And he says here, I laughed because I'd actually just been overseas and had just changed my phone number only 3 days earlier, but they managed to get straight to me on my mobile. Right, so they're not interfering with his operations, but they have been monitoring his operations. They have been acutely aware of the sort of broad migration and refugee activities that have been occurring, even if they hadn't necessarily directly interacted with these organizations prior to this particular incident. So I think this is illustrative of the fact that it's not just a lack of capacity, because Egypt, and this is true other cases as well, is acutely aware of all these activities that are going on, and they're also monitoring them. And they will intervene if they decide that an organization or an individual migrant or refugee has crossed a red line in that host state. So I also talk a lot in the book. It really sort of forms the backbone of the book, these migrant and refugee interviews. So I look a lot at what are the different consequences for individuals under these different types of policies, whether it's indifference or a more sort of de jure liberal policy or more repressive policy. So these are, just some photos from various neighborhoods where migrants and refugees live in these large urban environments with co-nationals. So they're having lots of interaction with co-nationals. Sorry, not co-nationals, host state nationals. They are sometimes interacting with host state authorities, but they're also sort of given this ability to be relatively anonymous in the host state. And that means that they can sort of find opportunities, economic opportunities sometimes. They can sometimes receive assistance from international organizations. They can form community organizations, sometimes political organizations. So there's different sort of boundaries for what they can do, but for the most part, they can, in some sense, de facto integrate socially and economically into these host states. And then lastly, I'll just talk a little bit about what the policy implications are from the findings of this book. So as I said earlier, a big part of this story is this EU externalization of migration and refugee policies over the past several decades. And in the second half of the book, or I guess really just the last two chapters, I talk quite a bit about what does all of this mean in the context of things that have come out of the quote unquote crisis of 2015. So we see, sort of enhanced EU externalization since then, all these migration deals. They've impacted the countries that I'm looking at, of course, as well as other countries in the region and even countries further afield. And I argue that if we're going to see this continued EU externalization, which we likely are, because even the new pact on migration and refugees from the European Union from September effectively promises further relationships and effectively deals with third countries, then I think we're going to see similar patterns at play as well. So indifference and informality for migrants and refugees. So migrants and refugees' lives in these host states will continue to be characterized by possible participation in informal economies and social opportunities, but also precarity and uncertainty about whether they should remain or potentially try to carry on or return home if that's possible. I think we might see de jure liberal policies, as we saw in Morocco and Turkey, if there are economic and diplomatic gains to be had from doing so. But again, the fact that the pathway to implementing those reforms was driven by economic and diplomatic gains means that we probably won't see meaningful change for migrants and refugees on the ground. And then we also might see repressive policies if migrants or refugees are deemed a security threat or become highly politicized. I talk in the book about how this is the case with Egypt. And as I was finishing up writing the book, I talked briefly about how this was the case with Turkey just last year. But I think an important message from the book is that global South host states can't just be considered, in terms of this EU externalization, they really can't just be considered as just recipients of the policy choices of more powerful states or international actors. And they actually have their own strategic interests. And this book is all about understanding what those strategic interests are, and sort of they need to be taken seriously and given a meaningful seat at the table if we're ever going to come up with a more equitable international system that regulates migration and refugee assistance. So I'll briefly just also show you the table of contents so you can get a better sense of how the book is structured. So chapters 3, 4, and 5 are the sort of central empirical chapters that talk about each case in depth and the trajectories that I was discussing. And then chapter 6 looks specifically at individual migrants and refugees of varying nationalities, as well as religion and race, and tries to understand whether things like culture, host state sense of belonging might influence how states are reacting to migrants and refugees. Chapters 7 and 8 really sort of zoom out to understand what happened with the 2015 refugee crisis, as well as responses we've seen since then. Chapter 7 looks at the role of these international organizations, UNHCR and IOM, as well as their funders, so countries of the EU and other global north countries. And then chapter 8 sort of updates everything that I've presented so far in terms of what's happened since 2015. And lastly, the conclusion argues that, even though I'm focusing on the Middle East, North Africa region, that the arguments here could be applicable to other countries and other regions of the world that are seeing similar patterns at play in terms of externalization of migration and refugee policies from countries of the global north, whether it's the US or Australia, and the implications that has for what are often thought of as transit countries that in reality are also host countries because of these changing policies of global north states. So I will stop there and we'll turn it over to Gerasimos, I believe.
Well, thanks, Kelsey. That was fantastic, and really look forward to reading the book. So I think, Gerasimos, if you want to share your screen, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much again, Andrew, for this kind invitation. And thank you also to Kelsey for joining us. It's a pleasure and an honor to be sharing the stage with such fantastic work on the politics of migration and refugees in the Middle East. My work, and this is a manuscript in development, touches very much on Kelsey's work and looks exactly at what's happening in terms of migrant and refugee states in the Middle East once they are beyond the stage of indifference. So how do they start instrumentalizing populations, particularly refugees, for a number of benefits? And I start off with this picture of the Zaatari camp in Jordan, arguably the largest organized concentration of Syrian refugees in the world, and a camp that was created, according to Jordanian elites I interviewed, partly as a way to demonstrate to the international community the extent of the issue that Jordan was facing vis-a-vis Syrian refugees. So that has something to do with what I'm trying to understand in my talk, namely how do refugee flows feature in the politics of host states of first asylum? So these are the states that are immediately the target of refugee outflows from areas of conflict or instability. And secondly, how do they affect their international relations? How do they affect their diplomatic strategies, which is something that Kelsey touched upon in the context of the Middle East and North Africa region, but also in the wider global South. The argument that this forthcoming book makes is that forced migration flows create what I call refugee rentier states. If you're unaware of the term rent in international relations and political science, it refers to unearned income that states might be able to accrue from outside sources. We usually tend to refer to oil rentier states. So states like Saudi Arabia or Libya, for instance, are considered oil rentier states because they're able to draw on a specific resource within their territory, namely oil, in order to accrue revenue from outside. States like Israel, for instance, are considered strategic rentier states because they're able to secure funding from the United States because of their strategic value for that state. I argue that there needs to be a discussion of a new type of state that I call the refugee rentier state. States that host forcibly displaced populations and rely financially on external rent that is linked to how they treat these groups. The key difference here, of course, is that whereas Saudi Arabia would receive funding in order to share the resource of oil, in the case of refugee rentier states, the funding is directed mostly in the condition that these states continue to withhold sharing forcibly displaced communities with other states. And I argue that what we have is the development of a range of refugee rent-seeking strategies as these states, predominantly in the global south, seek to target international organizations or third states in order to secure the funding necessary to continue hosting these groups, direct economic aid, grants, preferential trade agreements, what have you. So the way this works draws on my fieldwork in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. So I will talk briefly about these three cases in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis. Jordan, first of all, concludes in early 2016 what is now called the Jordan Compact, an agreement between the European Union and the Kingdom of Jordan that grants the latter some $700 million worth of grants, plus the same amount in the coming financial year, in exchange for Jordan continuing to host Syrian refugees within its borders. In fact, the compact goes as far as to identify that we need a new paradigm that links economic development and forced displacement in Jordan that will benefit Jordanians and Syrian refugees alike. So the key goal of the compact, and this is a quote from the document, is to turn the Syrian refugee crisis into a developmental opportunity, one that will include investments that opens up the country to the EU market with simplified rules of origin, one that benefits not merely refugees, but also the Jordanian citizens. And this is primarily the benefit to Jordanian citizens, so the benefit to non-forcibly displaced populations that the element of refugee rent comes in. In particular, in terms of Jordan, the Jordanian policymakers were able to negotiate access to the concessional financing facility that normally is only targeting middle-income states, so they won a number of low-interest loans there, but very importantly, they won tariff-free access to the European Union market for goods produced within what Jordan calls special economic zones, provided, of course, that Jordan opens up these zones into employment for Syrian refugees as well. So Jordan promises to offer some 200,000 positions within these zones for Syrian refugees to work, in exchange, of course, for preferential entry into the European market. A very similar thing happens with Lebanon in terms of what is called the Lebanon Compact or the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan. Again, we have hundreds of millions of euros being offered to Lebanon in exchange for continuing to support Syrian refugee communities within its borders. Yet again, we see the same kind of language that aims to shift the crisis into an opportunity to improve prospects of security, stability, and resilience for the entire country of Lebanon. So you see, in this country, in this case as well, we have a range of specific groups of funding targeting a range of Lebanese sectors that have little to do with Syrian refugees, anything from a national plan to safeguard children and women, to solid waste management programs, to the upgrading of the Lebanese parliament infrastructure that arguably benefit Lebanon more broadly rather than Syrian refugee communities within Lebanon's borders. The third country, and arguably probably the most well-known country in terms of these processes, is Turkey, which negotiates at roughly the same time, early 2016, the EU-Turkey statement, an infamous document that provides Turkey with some 3 billion euros worth of aid, plus 3 more forthcoming, in exchange for strengthening its external borders with the European Union, primarily Greece. In exchange, of course, for making sure that Syrian refugees are unable to cross the Aegean Sea into European territory. And perhaps in one of the most obvious examples of refugee rent, Turkey also negotiates or has European policymakers agreed to negotiate the roadmap towards visa liberalization, that in exchange for hosting Syrian refugees in Turkish territory, Turkish citizens are promised to see the visa requirement for traveling into the European Union lifted. At the end of the day, all of this, some of this hopefully is known to the audience, and an immediate response would be, well, that sounds like a good thing. That sounds like what we would call a win-win-win scenario in which the host states benefits, the sending states benefit, the refugee themselves see some benefit. So what is the problem here? And what I aim to do in this manuscript is sort of criticize or draw some sort of critical points against the shift towards what I would call refugee commodification, sort of the use of refugees for distinct political economy reasons. One example here of the difficulties or the risks associated with such a turn towards refugee compacts or refugee deals has to do with the fact that at the end of the day, this paves the way for novel patterns for developing countries of the global south to become dependent on the calculated kindness, to quote another famous scholar of migration studies, to the kindness of international donors. One example from this project has to do with what I mentioned a few slides ago, namely the 200,000 employment opportunities that Jordan promises to offer to Syrian refugees. Of course, these posts never actually materialize. For a number of reasons, Jordan by 2017 only gave about 60,000 work permits to Syrian refugees, creating a significant tension between the Jordanian government and international donors. As a result, what we see happening in Jordan is a scrambling of trying to identify ways to hire more Syrian refugees. The Jordanian Ministry of Labor gives multiple work permits to each Syrian, so there is an attempt to sort of manipulate the initial agreement a bit. What's more interesting is the effect of this agreement to other migrant and refugee communities within Jordan. As Andrew mentioned, I wrote a book on Egypt, so I'm particularly sensitive to questions of Egyptian migrants in the Middle East. One of the things we identify at the same time as the Jordanian government scrambles to find employment opportunities for Syrians is that we have a clampdown on Egyptians working and living in Jordan. So we have harassment, imprisonment, and also frequent deportations of the large community of unskilled and low-skilled Egyptian migrants working in Jordan. And the links between that and the opportunities for Syrian refugees is quite evident. So that's one example that I identify in terms of the perils of this type of refugee rent-seeking behavior. At the same time, what we see is an attempt to skew host state policies towards attracting external funding. If you remember, I started off the presentation with a picture of the Zaatari camp. One of the things that came up again and again in fieldwork has to do with the decision to construct refugee camps in Jordan, primarily in order to make this displaced population visible to international donors. So we see that the decision to create or not a refugee camp in Jordan has a lot to do with the financial and material needs of this host state. What's interesting in Jordan as well has to do with an accusation that the Jordanian government has inflated the numbers of Syrians living within its territory. The UNHCR puts the figure roughly at a bit over 650,000 refugees. The Jordanian government frequently talks of over 1.3 million living there. And this is something that if you look at it critically, you can see that there is a distinct rationale for trying to magnify the extent of this problem from the Jordanian perspective. Interestingly, if you look at this from a more discourse analysis sort of prism, what you see is that we develop a narrative of crisis and state incapacity across Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. Two quotes here because I only have so much time. King Abdallah in Jordan would mention again and again, frequently within international fora, the fact that Jordan is at a breaking point. Jordanians have had it up to here. The country can't support Syrian refugees, so we need the international community's support. At the same time, this rhetoric has been echoed by Prime Minister Hariri of Lebanon, where he said as well that, well, Lebanon is at the verge of a breaking point, going as far as to estimate the number of dollars that the international community should award to Lebanon in order to make sure that it supports Syrian refugees for the next half a decade. And this is, of course, not to undermine the extreme problem the extreme circumstances that Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey have faced. It is more to show the extent to which the needs for material support have cascaded into this narrative of crisis and state incapacity. Arguably, from research I've done across the three states, what we see also is arguably what I would call a normative and substantive encouragement of using refugees as an instrument of material gain. Beyond the state level, what we see on the sub-state level is a number of laws and regulations across the two countries that aim to benefit materially from these refugees. In Lebanon, for instance, we have the introduction of a law that expects all Syrians over 15 years of age to pay $200 in a residency fee, even though most of them live below the poverty line, $200 being quite a lot of money. Those that are unable to pay for this end up being arrested, which creates a situation for even further refugee rent-seeking behavior as they try to somehow bribe their way out of prison or make sure they escape incarceration. What ends up happening in Jordan is in mid-2014, we have the introduction of the bailout process, in which the state creates a regime of sponsorship in which any Syrian refugee that has found themselves within a refugee camp is able to pay their way out, to find a Jordanian citizen that is willing to sponsor them and to let them escape the refugee camp. What the UNHCR has estimated is that Jordanian middlemen receive around $500 in order to act as sponsors. And you'll see here the interesting use of the language of sponsorship. Anybody working on the Gulf will pick this up. You see the extent to which Jordanian citizens are able to benefit from this money merely because of their citizenship. In Lebanon, a very similar stark situation in which individual sponsorships go for up to $1,000. This is from one refugee that reported that Lebanese potential sponsors actually wait on the Syrian border or they wait at the airport to sell sponsorships to new arrivals. So you see how he argued sponsors are making a business out of the Syrian refugee crisis. And ultimately, and this is perhaps the more extreme version of this, shift towards refugee commodification has to do with the use of refugees as an instrument of interstate coercion, in which not only do we lose any discourse of human rights or the global refugee regime, but we use them instrumentally. We see states using refugees instrumentally as bargaining chips. So we see this, for instance, in the case of Turkey, where Erdogan, in the negotiations leading up to the EU-Turkey statement, said, well, you know, we hold all the cards, we can open up the borders and put refugees on buses. So how will you deal with that problem? Will you kill the refugees? So you can see the extent to which refugee commodification has been embroiled into the discourse of elites in the Middle East. So I'm painting a rather stark picture here, partly to draw parallels to what Kelsey was saying towards the end of her talk, which is the shift across in the international community towards more such agreements of refugee deals or refugee compacts. So we see this across policymakers' circles, primarily in North America, where we have we have a jobs compact in Ethiopia being agreed a few months ago. We have the argument for a compact from Bangladesh. We have refugee compacts being put forth as best practice examples. So hopefully what I'm giving you here from these examples of the Middle East paint a bit more critical picture of how these compacts might translate into refugee commodification. And to conclude, I promised to say a bit about the broader global south in this talk, and just for a couple of minutes, one of the things that I'm investigating with a couple of other colleagues, Nick Piczynski and Feline Fryer, has to do with how this shift towards compacts and refugee commodification is being diffused over a range of refugee host states in the broader global south. So you might remember a few minutes ago talked about Jordan being accused of artificially inflating the number of refugees. This is something that Uganda also found itself guilty of, or Ugandan elites were accused back in 2018 of a similar scheme that exaggerated the number of refugees within the country for material gain. Another example here has to do with Kenya, of course, still in sub-Saharan Africa. In the case of Kenya, what we see is elites threatening repeatedly to close down the Dadaab camp, one of the largest refugee camp in the world, as they went on record saying that, well, we do this in order to make sure that the UNHCR realizes that they need to do more to support the Kenyan struggle with forced displacement. One of the Jordanian officials that one of my colleagues interviewed back in 2016 expressed regret that the strategy that the government chose did not yield enough material benefit to the state. And he went on record to say, well, we should have really blackmailed the European Union like Turkey did. And finally, more closer to home, this is something that, of course, doesn't speak to phenomena across the global south, but also arguably across the global north. What we saw in Greece, this is a paper I'm finishing now with a colleague at Birmingham. In the context of the EU-Greece bailout negotiations, one of the things that the Greek government under Syriza repeatedly did is to use its position as a transit state of Syrian refugees in order to secure a better agreement with European Union creditors. So Panos Kamenos, the Greek defense minister at the time, went on record repeatedly stating that, well, unless we get a better deal from the Germans and from Brussels, we really will have to struggle to keep our borders safe and to prevent ISIS in particular from reaching European shores. So in conclusion, hopefully I've convinced you a bit that what happens in terms of this asymmetrical power distribution between the global north and the global south in the context of migration diplomacy encourages the emergence of what I call refugee rentier states. And we see a dangerous, in my opinion, phenomenon of refugee rent-seeking behavior that affects host states' domestic and foreign policies that is really linked to EU and global North actors policy making that aims to get towards this sort of out of sight, out of mind mentality. And hopefully what I've given you over the last 20 minutes sort of complements Kelsey's talk, in the sense that if we go beyond initial indifference, what we see here is this really underexplored dimension of how refugee rent-seeking behavior shapes the policy responses by states in the global south, and the precarious effects this might have for the future of global refugee governance. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Gerasimos. That was fantastic, and I've read the book, and I'd strongly recommend it to everyone to take a look at Gerasimos's book on the politics of migration in Egypt. So what we'll do now is we'll move to discussion. We've already had quite a few questions coming in, so excuse me if I start looking at different screens as I try to read the comments and questions that are coming in. I'm going to start with a comment that's come in. It wasn't able to access the chat function, but it's from Vincent Cochetel, who's the special envoy of the UNHCR for the Central Mediterranean situation. And Vincent has remarks which were directed predominantly, I think, at Kelsey. And what he says is that we should not mix up all the countries in the global south. Most of the sub-Saharan countries have refugee laws and regulations. None in North Africa have developed such frameworks, and comparing numbers is not that easy. So in the global north, refugees have a pathway to naturalization. So after 5 to 10 years, they're no longer refugees, which does not happen in the global south. If refugees had not become nationals of their host countries in the north over 6 decades, are we sure that today we will have more refugees today in the global south? And a second point from Vincent is that what, in your view, Vice Director Kelsey, are the impediments for all of North Africa for finally adopting asylum legislation 50 years after having ratified the Refugee Convention or the 1969 OAU Convention in the case of Libya? So those were directed primarily at Kelsey, though Gerasimos might come in on those as well. We have some others which I will put to you now. So questions that are coming from our audience on YouTube in the chat box. From Maria Ahmad, a question for Kelsey. And what Maria wanted to know more about was, well, one of the chapters in your book, more about UNHCR IOM role in host state policy outcomes, which obviously is a chapter in the book. From Karin Vargland, again for Kelsey, asking whether you see a pattern, is EU externalization linked to more liberal, repressive or indifference responses towards migrants from host states? Denise H has a question for Kelsey, which is asking how southern countries facilitate integration, and refers to what Denise calls spatial clusters, language, education as possibilities. And asks also, do they see fundamentalism or extremism problems in refugee populations? That's from Denise H. Sorry, while I just scroll down. There are other questions as well. There's some that are coming for Gerasimos. So Denise H asked Gerasimos, how much do other regions beside the EU contribute financially to facilitate infrastructures in those host countries? And Karin Vargland also asks Gerasimos, how do you relate the concept of refugee rentier state to the concept of coercive engineered migration by Kelly Greenhill? I wanted to sneak in a couple of questions as well. For Kelsey, I was very interested, your arguments centered around state capacity, and I wondered if, I'm sure you do in the book, but perhaps elaborate a little bit more, perhaps in relation to 2 core functions, welfare and security, because you talk about, particularly about indifference and informality. So I was wondering the extent to which thinking about indifference and informality in the delivery of, for instance, welfare might be a more general characteristic in relation to the whole population, rather than, and which could actually lend to perhaps contestation or conflict between groups if resources are limited. But it was really perhaps to elaborate, as I'm sure you do in the book, on this idea of state capacity in relation to core state functions. I also wanted to ask Gerasimos about, because it's a fascinating idea, and And I'm just learning about it now. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about the relationship of this to international standards, and in particular, tendencies towards what have been called localization of responses. So in a sense, keeping refugees closer to the countries from which they are displaced. And this seems, what you're discussing here seems to be consistent with that. And I was interested in the relationship of this argument about the rentier state to arguments also about the wider framework for the protection of the rights of refugees, and perhaps a possible tension between localization in the form of, say, rentier states and resettlement. And I was interested if you could perhaps expand on that. We do have other questions. So if we go back, I hope I didn't read them out too quickly and look too manic looking between screens. But so if we go back to Kelsey, and we do have other questions, so if we could be relatively brief so we can get as many people in as possible, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Andrew. I will try to answer these questions. I'm not sure I wrote all of them down correctly, but I'll start with what I remember. So the first question was about naturalization and sort of differentiating between different countries of the global south. And I think that's a very valid point. You know, I'm talking, the global south obviously encompasses so many countries of such varying experiences and situations currently in terms of hosting migrants and refugees. And you're right in that the naturalization isn't part of the equation. I mean, not in the countries that I was talking about. Although in the case of Turkey, there has been some naturalization of recently Syrian refugees, and actually in previous decades, certain Afghan refugees were allowed to naturalize as sort of a ploy by the state to gain effectively, you know, future voters that would support the political party in power. So it's not entirely out of the question, but for the most part, it's not. None of the refugees, or certainly the irregular migrants in the countries that I'm looking at, have the ability or will have the ability to naturalize. But I think that, you know, if we don't, naturalization is a very high bar. But so, for example, in the case of Morocco, there was the ability to, at least with this migration policy reform, to obtain a residency permit, which is not naturalization, but it is the ability to turn your status into a legal one, right? But again, this fell into this big 2013 reform that happened again with, and then there was a second reform process that happened several years later that again allowed for this regularization process. So there is this move towards, I would classify that as, you know, a liberal outreach towards these irregular migrants. But that sort of fell through because the people that were regularized would then have to obtain jobs, would have to sort of make their status more permanent, even if all they hold really is that residency card. And many were unable to do that because the time frame was so short, and there weren't sort of these other sensitization measures put in place to really allow for actual more integration, or something that would really be a liberal policy. So to reiterate, I think that we see these policies that are de jure liberal, but they're not actually doing the work that would be required to really make the state have, you know, a truly welcoming policy towards migrants and refugees. And I think the second part of that question was, well, how do we get states to implement asylum laws or maybe migration laws more broadly? And I think that this speaks to Gerasimos's work, because it's not going to be through this, you know, just sort of pouring money into countries, whilst also asking them to police borders so that people don't travel onwards towards Europe, right? So this pathway to reform that involves these very diplomatic economic incentives that are put forward or sort of incentivized by countries of the European Union don't necessarily lead to real change on the ground that would allow for actual integration, not naturalization, but, you know, if integration is sort of the bar that we're reaching for. So that's not a policy solution in terms of offering what does need to happen, but I think that just sort of pouring money into these countries is not going to lead to better policies in place for migrants and refugees, would be how I would answer that question. The second one I wrote down was about sort of elaborating briefly on the UNHCR and the IOM role in the countries that I look at. And this stemmed out of trying to understand whether, you know, to what extent can these organizations, which do yield sort of quite a lot of funding and have a presence in all of the countries that I'm looking at, what extent can they really impact domestic policies? And what I conclude in the chapter is that they actually don't have as much say as we might sort of give them in the literature, or we might assume that they have more sway in countries. Because I don't know if this counters your argument or is in line with your argument, Gerasimos, but it's not just about the money, right? There are other interests that the states have, whether it's security or pre-existing relationships with these organizations. So I spoke with, for example, UNICEF in Turkey, and they were allowed access to the Syrian refugee camps in Turkey before any other organizations were allowed, because they've been operating in Turkey for so long and they had established these relationships. So it really depends on the particular organization, and it depends on the interests of the state, and it's not just about sort of money that can be offered, even if that money does benefit host country nationals through development projects or through other types of things that Gerasimos talks about in his work. So I would just suggest reading the chapter, and I'd be super curious to hear your assessment of how you think I characterize the role, but I ultimately argue that it is the state at the end of the day that has full say over their domestic policies, and it's not the UNHCR and IOM can provide influence. They helped in the case of Turkey, for example, with rewriting this major law reform that Turkey undertook in 2013 and implemented in 2014. So the UNHCR and IOM were very involved in that, but only when the state requested their presence. And again, it wasn't, they had been asking for this sort of reform for years, and it wasn't until the interests were in place that Turkey actually decided to reform its laws. So I think that it really is the role of the state at the end of the day. In terms of integration and how is it facilitated, I would argue that states are, the three states I'm looking at anyway, are aware that some integration is happening, but it is still sort of this dirty word, right? So it's still something that that international organizations and NGOs have to be careful about when they're discussing this type of work with host states. So they don't necessarily want to acknowledge that migrants and refugees are staying for long periods of time, even if that is the case. And so integration is still sort of a touchy issue, even though it is occurring and the state officials are aware that it's occurring. So they do, I would argue that they facilitate it in allowing these organizations to provide, education or healthcare services, or sometimes, turning a blind eye to the sort of informal employment that happens. But I would say that it's still not something that's necessarily being encouraged, even though sometimes states might give lip service to it, especially if they're looking for financial, international development aid and financial support through the types of agreements that Gerasimos is talking about. And Andrew, your question, I'll just say that I do talk about state capacity quite a bit in sort of the more theoretical chapter of the book. And I am really interested, not so much in the welfare component, because in that regard, these states, especially Egypt, are quite weak. But in terms of the security aspect and the ability to sort of police and monitor and be aware of all these types of activities that are taking place, the state does exhibit, I would say, a great deal of capacity. And I would argue that there is this selective capacity. So if the state suddenly perceives some kind of benefit, whether it's diplomatic interests or relationships with sending states as well, in terms of implementing a new policy, one that requires more state resources, then they're willing to sort of up their capacity or reallocate their capacity in some way to make that happen. So again, it's more of, what I'm trying to argue is that there's this selective state capacity, and that non-policy does not mean a lack of capacity. And I think that there's other interesting work going on beyond just the migration and refugee literature that looks at when states are sort of selective about when they actually when they decide to act versus when they decide to refrain from acting, and that it's not about capacity, it's about strategy. So I'll stop there and let Gerasimos have some time.
Thanks, Kelsey. So over to you, Gerasimos.
Yeah, very briefly. And let me just say that I'm looking forward to COVID ending at some point and having this discussion in person as well, because there's so much that I agree with in terms of what Kelsey is saying. And you're absolutely correct in the sense that even though my initial sort of foray into this refugee rentierism argument has to do with political economy benefits, I think it's you, right, that made this great point about a few states like Egypt seeking other non-material benefits such as reputation or sort of closer engagement between an authoritarian regime and the European Union. So there's a lot to be said there, and I absolutely agree. Denise's point on other regions, absolutely. So whereas a lot of this gets presented as the global north sort of developing this special relationship with the global south, we see this We see other global South states also engaging with this, as well as third international organizations. You might be familiar, for instance, with what the Gulf has been doing. So GCC member states funding quite a bit of the refugee response in Jordan, primarily, in terms of camps, in terms of assistance. So we are seeing a lot of global South actors coming here. What's interesting for me is the fact that the Jordanian government has put a limit in accepting such bids or such generosity, quote unquote, unless it also comes with specific funding for Jordanian citizens. So I believe it is 50%. So at least 50% of the international aid that comes from Europe or from the global South needs to be directed to non-refugee populations. Otherwise, they will just reject the aid, which I think is a fascinating aspect of this. Karin's question on Kelly Greenhill, yes. So this is very much influenced by her wonderful work. I guess the main difference between the refugee rentier state and Greenhill's understanding of coercive engineered migration is that this is not engineered. So I don't think any policymaker in Jordan or Lebanon sought to have millions, hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees coming to the territory. So it is quite a different case from states like Libya under Gaddafi trying to instrumentalize refugee or create refugee flows. My work looks at states that have had to grapple with this phenomenon without having significant agency in this. So you could characterize them as transit states, I suppose, host states of first asylum. And Andrew's great question, I would say yes, absolutely. So it's this phenomenon of refugee rentierism is very much linked to the shift towards the localization of responses. In this, I would just be a bit cautious and sort of critical in terms of whether this kind of relationships promote a specific type of relations between the global North and the global South. So whether this localization of responses sort of encourages this sort of funding streams that flow from the global North to the global South under specific circumstances. And at the same point, another critical thing here has to do with policy diffusion between these localized actors. So one of the things I uncovered in my fieldwork has to do with the fact that in negotiating with the European Union, Lebanese policymakers often defer to the Jordanian ones. So the Jordanian side actually negotiated both for the Lebanese and for the Jordanian state. So what you see here is even more diffusion of refugee rentierism. So I would say that would be perhaps the paradox there. But there's a lot of questions, so I'll just stop here.
Thank you. There are some more questions coming in, and so we'll have a second round now, and I'll hopefully do justice to the questions. The first is for Kelsey from Mohammed Shakawi, and he's asking about crisis and the 2015 date, and asking why and how was it designed or designated as the date. How can we explain that? So that was a question from Mohammed. Then from Megan Garrity, a question for Kelsey. What Megan Garrity asks is, how does your argument generalize to other Syrian refugee host states like Jordan and Lebanon, where policies shifted within the same crisis from liberal at the start to more repressive as the crisis became protracted, despite significant international pressure to continue with the liberal approach? So that was from Megan Garrity. Sorry, just wait while I scroll down. Then we have a question from Josiane Matar, and I think that is a question for Gerasimos. So what Josiane asks is, what do you think is the best alternative to the policy of externalization? Would financial assistance based on conditions of reform benefit the refugees and reduce rent-seeking behavior? Katharina Portinhos asks, was a question for both of you. Do you see citizens or interest groups influencing agendas or lobbying for specific policies, and to what extent do you see that? Then we have a question from Lily Frost here at EUI, who asks two related questions for both of you. And she asked whether you see refugee rentierism and indifference working better with certain types of refugee policies, access to unskilled work, public education, etc., access to public welfare, skilled work, etc. Alternatively, do these concepts of your concepts aim to describe a general policy attitudes towards refugee groups rather than specific policies, plural? And I'll give you more questions because I do want to make sure we get everybody's questions in. We have a question from Nick Dines, former colleague here at EUI. Hello to Nick. Question for Kelsey. Is strategic indifference something you associate specifically with the MENA region? Might it not be a model that can also be associated with the global north, for instance, Italy in the 70s and 80s? And from Ivan Martin, who asks, I think it's a question for Gerasimos, which stretches over 2 or 3 things. But what Ivan asks is, your analysis is of course based on hard evidence and builds a compelling case. But what Ivan asks for is a preliminary social and economic cost benefit analysis of refugees for those states. And Ivan asks, are those states better off because of the arrival of big numbers of refugees? And if not, their rent-seeking strategies might be only a reactive strategy to minimize costs of a reality that's imposed on them, and not a proactive strategy to extract a rent out of refugees. And Ivan suggests that you look at the costs for those countries of the presence of large numbers of refugees as part of your research. I'm sorry to throw all these questions at you, but I know you're both very capable individuals. But this is for Gerasimos. It's from Megan Garrity, and asking whether you see the Refugee Compacts as essentially Western outsourcing of refugee burden sharing away from the West to the global South, cheaper and more domestically palatable for the West, or they may not produce better outcomes for refugees. So that's a lot of questions, some great points. And so I will ask Kelsey to come in first, please.
Great, thanks, Andrew. These are such great questions. I wrote down, I think, most of them, and I'll try to answer them to the best I can. But I also just really appreciate this feedback in the form of questions, because it's so interesting to see what people sort of take from the talk. So I think it was Mohammed, you asked a great question about why 2015, why is this considered the crisis? And I think you're absolutely right. It's such a Eurocentric point of view. There was so much going on prior to 2015 in terms of, if we're just looking at the Syrian uprising and subsequent numbers of refugees in neighboring countries, this was, a quote unquote crisis, right, well before 2015. But I think Gerasimos highlighted this in his presentation, and I talk about it quite a bit in the book, how 2015 did sort of change the stakes of the game. So in 2015, we saw this European externalization well before 2015, but the way that Europe responded to this, large increase in numbers of arrivals in 2015 has, greatly impacted relations in the Mediterranean, Europe's relationships with countries, not just in North Africa and the Middle East, but also further afield, and the responses from those countries as well. So it really did change in terms of what Europe was willing to offer, much larger agreements, larger sums of money, different types of deals that they hadn't made before in terms of, Gerasimos talked about the Jordan Compact. Lebanon also received a ton of assistance. The countries I looked at as well, Egypt and Morocco, have both responded in new ways to what has become available from Europe as a result of this, what Europe perceived as a major threat. So again, it is a very Eurocentric point of view, but it does, I think you do see, and I'd be curious to hear your feedback on the sort of final chapter of my book, which talks about how things were renegotiated in 2015 and subsequently in a way that they just hadn't been before. Although I think, I do talk also about 2014 was also an important year, because that was the year of the 3RP, the Refugee Resilience Response Plan. I forget the acronym, but anyway, that also sort of really recharacterized what international organizations were willing to offer host countries. So that sort of set the tone for what would become available in 2015 in terms of, international assistance had to benefit host country nationals, not just refugees. And that sort of created these incentives that countries in the region were responding to from 2015 onward. So 2014 is also an important year. It's not to say that everything happened in 2015, but there was, something significant that occurred that year, I think. In terms of, someone asked about policies shifting sort of within that 2015 and onward time period, or at least in response to the arrival of Syrians. And I think you're correct, because we saw varying responses, and we saw shifts over time in terms of the 3 neighboring countries that received the majority of Syrian refugees. So in the book, I look at Turkey's response, and I talk in Turkey a lot about this policy change that happened well before Syrians, or it was in the works before Syrians started arriving in Turkey. So it was, a policy that was built over time, or developed over time, from basically 2008 until it was decided upon in 2013. But with the arrival of Syrian refugees, that really hindered the ability of Turkey to actually enact the sort of reforms that it had envisioned. And I had people describe to me as, what we thought was going to be a shift to a rights-based approach to migration in Turkey became quickly all about security again, as it had been before. So I think it sort of hindered the ability of Turkey to maybe make the shift that could have happened differently if the sort of numbers of Syrians didn't arrive between 2011 and onward. And my colleague Lama Murad looks at Lebanon and also sees sort of what can maybe be characterized as an indifferent approach to Syrians initially, then characterized by quite a restrictive approach from, I think, 2014 onward, when refugees had to be, as Gerasimos talked about in his presentation, had to they had limited access to UNHCR status, and the ability to remain in the country became hindered, and their ability to access services was also, or even just to move around the country, became really difficult. So we definitely see shifts over time. And again, I think this is in response to both domestic politics, but also international relations, and the sort of diplomatic incentives that are on offer, and economic incentives on offer. Someone asked a question about what are citizens doing? And this is something I didn't talk at all about in the presentation, but I actually do talk quite a bit about in the book, which is, these different rights groups that exist in each of the countries and their role in affecting migration policy outcomes. So in Egypt, this is very hindered, especially after 2013, when it's become really difficult to do any kind of advocacy, whether it's migration related or not. It's basically impossible to protest. We see just a few days ago the kind of crackdown that still exists in Egypt today. So that kind of rights organizing has become extremely difficult in Egypt, but it did occur before, and I talk about that in the book. In Morocco, it's a very different situation, and rights groups have been extremely active, and were very instrumental in developing this, in influencing the government to adopt this 2013 policy change. And they used a tactic which was less to sort of, they pressured the government to the extent that they could, but then they also went to sort of the international arena and tried to use diplomatic pressure to push the government to reform. That was one element, I think, that led to the reform. And in Turkey, there have also been many rights groups. I won't go into it, but I do talk about it in the book. Sorry, I hope I'm not taking up too much time. I'll try to go quickly. So Indifference, whether it points to specific policies, I look in the book, I have a table in one of the initial chapters that looks at which policies I'm talking about and how it might apply, what indifference might look like across these different sort of sectors. So whether it's employment or access to services or access to residency, and I'll let you sort of assess that table and tell me whether you think that whether it's characterizing a larger policy or if it makes sense across those 3 sectors. But those are sort of the main sectors that I'm looking at in the book, how these different types of policies, whether it's liberal or repressive or indifferent, how they play out in those 3 policy areas. And then indifference in the global north. This is a great question, and one that I get often, and I've thought a bit about, and I talk about in the conclusion. And I think it could apply to countries of the global north, whether I think someone mentioned Italy, in earlier decades, or in the United States, but I think it would look different in the United States or in a country of the global north. So one component of indifference playing out in these countries that I've selected, which I call these transit turned host countries, is that international component is important. So the fact that international organizations are stepping in to provide services on the state's behalf has these benefits for the state. So it means that the state doesn't have to provide those services, but it also means this tangential funding for host country nationals and for the state itself. So that's, I think a central component of why Indifference works for countries when they're initially receiving migrants and refugees, or people are staying for longer periods of time. And that wouldn't play out in the same way in countries of the global north. So I think it would look a bit different, and that the factors that would incentivize a move from indifference to a more liberal policy or to a more repressive policy are also going to look different in a country of the global north that, the countries I'm looking at are semi-authoritarian to an extent. So that also matters, and it would be different, again, in a country like the US or a country like Italy. But I do talk about this sort of where else could it apply and the generalizability of the argument in the last chapter. So I'll leave it there and turn it back over to Gerasimos.
I'll be brief, I promise. I think all of them are excellent questions. I'll start from the back and make my way to the front. Ivan's point is absolutely well taken. And one of the reasons why I use the term rent is because it is value-free. So calling Saudi Arabia an oil rentier state or calling Jordan a refugee rentier state does not mean to say that I'm creating some sort of facile distinction between good states of the global south and the bad states of the global north, not at all. So I tried very much to show that this is something that, of course, many of these states have to do because they need to find the resources to cater to the needs of the refugee communities. But at the same time, I think hopefully you agree that by talking about rent, this allows us to get to that nitty-gritty of these policies that the host states develop, where they turn down funding if they don't benefit themselves. So if we're talking about a country that desperately needs money from the global north, then why would they reject a lot of funding bids if they do not include some funding for local citizens as well? So that is something that I'm trying to unpack a bit, but I take your point very much. Megan's point on outsourcing, yes, with the caveat that we also see global north states, to touch upon what Kelsey just said towards the end of her responses, but global north states also engage in refugee rent-seeking behavior. So that dichotomy between the two becomes a bit more blurry, I think. What is interesting here is that, well, you said, is this the way forward? Well, the question here becomes of whether this is sustainable as a solution. So whether refugee rent-seeking behavior sort of paves the way for the future of migration governance, and I argue it does not, primarily because it develops dependence in different ways, and because somebody at some point will have to have a policy shift. So we can't really keep supporting Jordan financially ad infinitum, and we have to find something more sustainable, and that leads to a different kind of burden sharing, perhaps going back to what we initially envisaged burden sharing to be. I would say, finally, did we lose Andrew? I think we lost Andrew. I would say the question on citizens that was also directed at me, I take a bit of a critical point there where I identify citizens' rent-seeking behavior vis-a-vis trying to profit economically from the presence of refugees. This is not, of course, a generalizable argument. I just try to examine how state-level policies of refugee rent-seeking tend to trickle down to specific groups of citizens that might also try to benefit out of refugees economically. And finally, Lily's excellent point, actually, and this is something that I have in the back of my mind as I develop this further, is the fact that, yes, this is refugee rentierism is a broader set of policies, you could argue, because the presentation was very much macro based. But at the same time, the more you look at sort of the micro level, you more see the tailored kind of responses towards specific donors. So in Jordan, for instance, that you're familiar with it as well, you see that the Jordanian elites target specific donors for specific kinds of projects. So it could be that the Swiss care more about education versus the Germans that care more about infrastructure. So very interestingly, the Jordanian refugee rentier state develops all these intricate mechanisms of securing aid for different projects by different donors. So I think that's really the next step in trying to understand host states' responses to this. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Gerasimos. So I missed some of that because I lost my connection, so I disappeared from view, and I've kind of gone to a place where I got stronger reception. So I can well, I can now let everybody know that we can all enjoy the presentation again, and both presentations on our YouTube channel. I'll be able to look back at that last question so I can catch one of the bits that I missed. So sorry, apologies for that. I'll be contacting my internet service provider about this. So I think that brings us to a conclusion for today's seminar. I'm really grateful to Kelsey and to Gerasimos for taking the time to join us this afternoon. And as Gerasimos says, it's a pity we have to do this through webinars, but actually it also does provide us an opportunity to get a really great audience and to connect with people all over the world to discuss these really important questions and the research that's been developing around them. So thanks to Kelsey, thanks to Gerasimos, thanks also to everybody who's joined us this afternoon and everybody who's asked us such great questions. And before we finish, we will be having another webinar in 2 weeks' time, Wednesday the 2nd of December, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Central European time. And that will be on the theme of Brexit, based on a new book published by Cambridge University Press by Maria Sobolewski and Robert Ford called Brexit Land, Identity, Diversity and the Reshaping of British Politics. We'll be organising that with the European Governance and Politics programme here in the Schumann Centre at the EUI. So we'll be publicising that through our usual networks. So thanks a lot for joining us, and we hope to see you at more of our events. Bye.